Welcome to the CompTIA A+ 220 1101 or Core 1 exam. This is Objective 3.4, Motherboard Connectors. One of the largest connectors on your motherboard is one that is providing power directly from the power supply to the motherboard. This provides main motherboard power at 3.3 volts, plus or minus 5 volts, and plus or minus 12 volts. Originally, this was a 20-pin connector, and as the years have gone by, we've needed some additional power for the motherboard. So now the standard size for this motherboard power connector is a 24-pin connector. If you have a motherboard with an older 20-pin connector, you can still plug in this 24-pin connector and use it. Some power supplies even have this connector module. So it has 20 pins and then you attach 4 more pins to it. Well, I was just speaking about 20 pins and 24 pins. Take a look at the differences between these two connectors. Well, something's wrong. There's a missing pin on the right image, isn't there? Before connecting the power supply to the motherboard, you want to first make sure that you've disconnected from all the power sources and then connect that directly to the motherboard with the orientation that matches the keys on the individual pins. On this particular connector, there's a lock on the side of that corresponds with the lip that's coming off of the end of the connector, so that when you push it down into the connector, it locks in place. And this will not move out of the connector until you push down and unlock it from that power connector. It keeps it secure and fastened so nothing moves out or you have a problem. Okay. Take a look at this 4-pin ATX. We were just speaking about the 20-pin missing 4 pins. Some motherboards need additional power for the CPU, and usually these connectors are physically located somewhere near the CPU itself. This is a 4-pin ATX connector. That ATX stands for Advanced Technology Extended, and it refers to a family of motherboards. This is a connector that provides 12 volts of power, usually that CPU that's on the motherboard. These connectors are usually labeled as CPU or P4, or it might be written on an ATX 12 volt. And there are keys on these connectors as well. So there's only one way to plug it into the motherboard. Here's a motherboard that does not have a CPU installed yet, but you can see that the CPU socket is at the bottom. And here near the top of the image is the 4-pin connector. It even says on the motherboard ATX 12 volt, referring to the 12 volt power that's provided on that connector. You'll also find a number of storage connections on the motherboard. One of these would be SATA connections. These colored connectors are the SATA or serial ATA connectors that are commonly used to connect hard drives today. Some motherboards will have different types of connections. They may be in a different layout or they may be a different color. But all of this is exactly the same SATA connection. And you would use these connectors for any of your storage devices. There may be situations where you don't have any room to install a new drive instead of your computer case, or perhaps you have an external drive that you would like to use. Well, in that case, you might want to use an eSATA connection for external serial ATA. That external connection is usually provided with the built-in interface on the motherboard. Or in this particular example, it's an expansion card that adds additional eSATA connectors to the back of this computer. This allows us to connect to an external storage device, but we still have the same throughput and performance as an internal SATA connection. So when you install that expansion card, it'll look like this. It's pretty hard to make a mistake for a different kind of connection. eSATA has a very specific square shape. It's different from a SATA connection, which has an L shape. Also, notice the difference between perhaps an HDMI interface. Another important set of connectors on your motherboard are the headers. Sometimes you'll hear these referred to as pin headers because they are groups of pins that are on the edge of the motherboard. They are usually a single large connector or a number of smaller individual wires that would connect to all of these pin headers. These might provide power or have USB connectivity, or they might provide the button connectivity that you have on the outside of your computer case. On this motherboard, these pin connectors are at the bottom, and you can see that there are a number of different groupings of pins. Some of them are labeled AAFP. This is referring to the external audio connectors that are on the case of your computer. And there are other connectors on here as well. Some of the USB and other audio functions, if you look closely on your motherboard, can often tell exactly what the pin headers are used for. On this motherboard, there are 5 different groups of pin headers. You've got a TPM. This is a trusted platform module. You've got 2 USB connectors, probably for some legacy USB devices. And then you've got 2 USB 3.0 connectors that are on the motherboard as pin headers. And some of the pin headers on your motherboard provide power and control for the cooling fans. Many computer cases have an on and off button on the case itself. There might be a reset button, and there might be other controls as well. The way that you have to integrate those buttons with the motherboard itself is through these types of connectors that are provided on the case. These connectors are even labeled. These are the connectors used for the reset switch. There's one for the hard drive light, and there's one for a power light. You would then connect those case connectors to the pins that are on the motherboard, and then the motherboard labels where you connect those pins. These 2 are the power connections, and here are the reset buttons and so on. Nowadays, you might find that your motherboard has an M.2 connector. This is on the newer motherboards that support connectivity using the M.2 standard. One very common use of these M.2 connectors is to plug in an SSD and be able to have all the storage of this very small device connected to the motherboard. To use this, you'd probably plug in the M.2 connector on the motherboard. You would push the drive all the way into the M.2 connector and then fasten it with a screw. This will ensure that whatever you're connecting into the M.2 interface will be firmly fastened to the motherboard itself. Well, we're at the end of this objective. Here's a pop quiz. What kind of connection would you find on a motherboard pin header? Okay, A, 24-pin ATX connection. B, a SATA or hard drive connection. C, an eSATA or external hard drive connection. Or D, a power button. And if you answered a power button, you would be correct. All kinds of different buttons and functionality need these power from the motherboard, and we connect them through these pin headers and these cables that are labeled. Thanks for watching.